Let's go through and show you how I built this table, but before I do that, take a moment to subscribe if you like my content and you want to see more videos just like this. You'll see how I cut the legs through the top of the table and then miter the edges of some boards to make the legs look like they come from a single walnut beam. First, I start by measuring the width and the length of each board. This gets it ready to rip on the table saw and allows me to be really economical with the amount of the lumber that I use for each table build. I measure those widths to cut off just a small amount. After it runs on the table saw, I run it through the planer to get it down to a nice even thickness that allows me to glue them up really smoothly when it's all said and done. After that, I go to work on the miters for the legs. I rip down the lengths of the legs with a nice miter, and then I work on the caps with the Craig's miter jig. These little blocks right here are actually fillers for the bottom of the leg, and then on the top of the leg where the hanger bolts will go to give it a nice level of strength as it attaches to the table. I go ahead and I glue these nice. As I go to glue them, though, I use my pin nailer just to hold the blocks in place. Now they're fit really snugly, so they're not going to move when all these things are clamped together with that squeeze out there at the end. But those little pin nails really do help me glue it up. Trim the edges here, and I start working on the top. Every time I work on the top of a table, I mark where I'm going to cut the dominoes, that I label each one of the individual boards so that I know where they go when I turn around to glue them up. I use the Festool Domino XL here to cut some loose tenons. I use a loose setting because it allows me to hammer these boards together well. It adds some strength to the tabletop, but most importantly, allows me to glue all 8 of these boards together at a single time and ensure that they get perfectly level. Now, I do not have a giant clamp rack in my studio because it's just not big enough to have that in my facility, but I do have a lot of clamps, lot of loose tenons, lots of clamps, lots of hammering here, a fair amount of glue to get those edges nice and snug. Now you'll notice that I do not glue both sides of the edges. That's because I use a lot of glue on one side, rub it, make sure it covers the whole thing. And then when it's all said and done, you're going to see me rough sand all of the pieces with my Festool RO 150. That really ripped through the glue, and I am thankful I didn't hurt myself there. But here we go with the Festool RO 150. This usually takes a couple of hours. Inevitably, for each tabletop, there's a couple of knot holes that I need to fill a little bit, a few that are deeper, so I use some quick curing epoxy to do that. This is System 3 quick cure epoxy. I think it works fantastic. I add some black pigment to it so it looks nice and clean when it's all said and done. It cures in a couple of minutes. Usually I leave it overnight, and then I sand it back with the RO, get that nice and flat. Sometimes there's a couple of little micro bubbles in it as well that I fill with wood filler. After this process, it's rough sanded, the knots are filled. I take the track saw and I rip down the edges of the table to the exact size that the customer is asking for. Run it nicely on it. Allows me to get perfect straight cuts wonderfully. Now here is that process that I told you about at the beginning, where I'm cutting the legs through the top of the table. After I glue up the legs, I've got them sanded. I set them on the tabletop, specifically in the quarters they're going to go. I line them up and use the track saw again. This track saw comes in perfectly handy every time I use it. Now, since the blade is circular, it actually does not get all the way through the table, does not make the full cut as it needs to do. So you're going to see me in just a second. After I use the track saw, I'm going to use the oscillating tool with a nice large blade to finish up these cuts so that I can snap off those corners, and then I go back on the inside and work through trimming it up nice and neat. I start to work on the aprons here. The aprons are the things that hold the legs nice and straight and secure. They actually work in conjunction with the cuts through the tabletop, but I cut the aprons perfectly to size to meet those gaps on the tabletop. using the miter saw, measuring it by hand. Then I work on the angle braces that will hold the leg. I start cutting the little recesses for the figure 8 tabletop fasteners that I use for each table with an apron, really to secure the base. It allows the tabletop to move and flow. Before I really start gluing things up though and finishing it up, I want to get them sanded. It just makes life a lot easier on the final steps of the process. Securing the tabletop fasteners to the table, securing the angles, the leg supports to the aprons. And I go to work on the legs here. I got to notch out the legs, and you'll notice that I leave a little bit of a tab at the top of the legs. That is the portion that you'll see when the table is assembled. We don't want a 90-degree angle there coming through the tabletop. So I do this by hand. I don't use the table saw. Actually, I'm pretty good at cutting this at 45 degrees by eye. It's not that big of a deal to get it perfect. Really, I just need a spot where the drill bit will hit and connect for when I go to set the hanger bolts. And that's what I'm doing here. I take the leg, I put it in the corner. I use my Festool drill to drill in the holes for the hanger bolts. I've got these really cool DeWalt fittings for my drills that allows me to drill in those hanger bolts. I get the hanger bolts in there, then I apply the glue on the 45-degree angles. After I apply the glue, I do one more nice snug fit with the hanger bolts and the nuts that are going to eventually secure the legs. I put the screws in to hold those miters nice and tight with the glue. I let it dry, then I pull them and I get to work on the final sanding of the table. Each table I work on takes somewhere between 5 to 10 hours to sand, even though I've got these really, really cool sanders from Festool. I end up going and dancing through probably 2 to 3 different types of sanders when I do each project. I start with the RO to rough sand it in Rotex mode. Then I move to this ETS 5mm rotation. And then if I'm sanding over 120 grit, I use the ETS with a 3mm rotation. And what that does is it allows me to get that finish, that sanding process, almost 100% perfect for each and every table I built. And then after I sand it, I water pop it with some mineral spirits that allows me to wipe off all of the existing dust on it and gets the table itself ready for finishing. Allows the finish to bond. In this case, I'm using Enduro True 2K polyurethane. It's a 2-part kind of epoxy polyurethane blend. It's the hardest, most durable finish that General Finishes uses or has, and I am very excited to use it for this table. What it allows the color of the table to do is it keeps the wood looking almost totally natural after the finish dries before you spray it on. It looks absolutely natural and perfect. And I sand it down and then coat it one more time with the finish prior to assembling it and showing off the table in all its beauty.
All right, friends, let's take a close look at the table. Look at this. Look at those legs. Waterfall edges, mitered corners, even coming up over the top. Grain line matches in direction. Woo-hoo. And of course, you gotta keep the knot holes. The knot holes, they're just beautiful. Love them. Check that out in all its glory.
And here we go, finishing up the video with some still photos of this beautiful table. While we are looking at them, please make sure to subscribe and enable notifications. While you're at it, leave me a comment, give me some feedback, let me know how to make these better and more informative.